Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the Terrace Scottish Football Podcast. I am your host, Craig Fowler, and I'm delighted to be joined by the host, the presenter of the excellent BBC Sounds podcast series, Romanov, the Czar of Hearts. That is, of course, Martin Geissler. Martin, how's it going? Thanks for coming on.
It's good. Thanks for having me on. Delighted to be here. Happy to be talking about a project that's been close to my heart for a long time.
Well, we'll get to that in a second, but firstly, you must be delighted with the feedback it's received. I've seen nothing but praise for the series from not only Hearts fans, but any fans of other clubs who have listened in as well.
Yeah, fans, clubs across Scotland, fans of clubs in England, people from further afield around the world have been in touch. It's been unbelievable, and it's been almost uniquely positive, which is amazing. I normally kind of swim in the swampy waters of Scottish politics, and 90% of the people who have anything to do with me in terms of feedback are just coming on to enthusiastically tell me how much of an arsehole I am and how useless I am at my job. So it's been tremendously refreshing. I'm slightly bewildering to have this kind of tsunami of appreciation, and it actually is appreciation, because people are appreciating the amount of work it took to put together. And this is where I get my caveat in really early, because I was the kind of kiddie along for the joyride on all of this. It was two or three other guys at BBC Scotland who've been working on this for months and months and months as a proper full-time labour of love, who are the guys who are responsible for the production and the way it sounded and the glossy feel of it, but also for the journalism and the research and the kind of the storytelling, which I think, there's no humility issue for me to say I think it was brilliant, because it wasn't down to me, it was down to them.
Yeah, well, you could act as their spokesperson for when I ask you some of the questions of how things kind of came together.
Listen, I do the least work and take most of the praise. That's absolutely brilliant.
So that kind of reminds me of being a review for the Terrace, actually, to be fair. But let's start with the big news that came out of the series. So you done kind of 9 episodes of the kind of narrative structure of what happened, and we'll get to some of that later on. But you finished it off, episode 10, a bonus podcast with Vladimir Romanov himself. Can you tell us, again, I'm assuming it was the guys behind the scenes, but can you tell us how he was tracked down? Because he was quite a customer who I was aware already journalism was very difficult to get hold of.
Well, turns out not that difficult. I mean, we didn't think we would get him. We started this series, we were down. I've been doing my part in this has been, as I said, kind of negligible compared to the others, but it's taken up quite a lot of my time nonetheless, and a lot of spare hours here and there. And I devoted a full week about October. So start of October, about 6 months ago, to just getting a load of interviews in the can. And we did a load of them in Glasgow on the Monday, went down to London Tuesday, Wednesday, and picked up Graham Ricks and George Fuchs and Ian Murray and a couple of other people, and then back up here and had another 2 days hard going. It was, I think, actually maybe even that week. It was the middle of that week that we finally heard that we'd got Romanov. And the guys had tried a few kind of normal, kind of more traditional journalistic routes. We interviewed a couple of authors who've written books, or journalists who've written books about him, and they had to kind of go to him to try and get his right to reply or his response to some of the allegations that were made. So they had lawyers' numbers, and that kind of led to nothing. A couple of other dead ends. And genuinely, when we started making this, we didn't know what country he was in, let alone whether or not there's any chance he'd speak to us. And we had to assume that he wouldn't. But equally, journalistically, we had to take every effort we could take to give him the right to reply to a lot of what people were saying to him. Anyway, here's the nub of it. We eventually sat down with Anatoly Korobochka, who was one of the many managers of Hearts under Romanov's reign. And at the end of the interview, during the process of setting up that interview, James Christie, the producer, said to him, "You know where he is, do you?" And Korobochka says, "Yeah, I saw him last week." So, what? He said, yeah. I was just wishing him a happy birthday the other week, and we catch up. He's knocking about, cutting about Moscow, quite the thing. I said, "Well, can we speak to him? Would you put him in touch with us?" Yeah, I'll give him your email address. So a few days later, James is perusing his emails, and up pops this one in Russian, and he puts it through Google Translate, and it says, "Dear Jim, I hear you want to speak to me. It's Vladimir Romanov here." And so it began. And he was enthusiastic. He was keen to talk. He hadn't, we're the first people to speak to him, certainly about Hearts, in well over a decade. So, yeah, he had a lot to say, didn't he?
I know,
and he wanted to say it.
He certainly did. He certainly did. And having got him and having kind of kept this in the bag that this was going to be the way that the podcast series finished, how worried were you all that it was sorry, how hard was it, first of all, to keep that, to sit on that, to not tell anybody in case it leaked?
Man, I mean, the circle was small. There was a few people in the BBC who knew we'd got him. And you kind of worry that it's going to inevitably get out. I mean, a building full of journalists, it's pretty difficult to keep a small circle. And I have to confess, I'm not sure even James knows this. I told one of my best pals, the guy I sit beside Hearts every week, one of my best mates. I told him at the start because I just couldn't know, and I was bursting. But you had
to tell somebody. You just simply had to tell somebody.
No way, it would have killed me. And he was really interested in the project and what are you doing and why are you doing it and who have you spoken to and all the rest of it. And I snuck, when I was doing the interview with Romanov, right, there's a laptop on the table in front of me with the screen open. And I got my phone out and snuck a photo mid-interview of me and him just sitting there on opposite side of the screen with the cans on. And we were in the diggers, actually, before, I can't remember who the Hearts were playing, but before a Hearts game, mid-October, because I'd just done the interview. And he's quietly got the phone out and just went like that. Look at that. And so he was then in the circle, but sworn on pain of death to secrecy. So I had somebody who I could go to and share it with, so I wouldn't burst. But it was hard.
Yeah, and also as well, you must.
I'm glad we did it that way though, because dropping it like that at the end of episode 9, having given no hint that we got anywhere near him, and just having that right at the end of episode 9, that absolute depth charge. I'm Vladimir Romanov. Now I want to tell you my story. It got the reaction we hoped it would. It was brilliant.
And narratively as well, it's probably it'd be a great place to end the series, because just due to the fact that when he first came in, the whirlwind start of Romanov was when he first came in. And then the story just kind of naturally, especially if you're looking at it from just a kind of Scottish football Hearts perspective, his interest wanes, Hearts get worse, the financial problems gets worse, and then you kind of have the rebirth at the end, which, to be fair, would have been narratively another strong way in which to finish it. But it's not quite the sexiness, the bang, the razzmatazz of like the early episodes when it was like Romanov coming into town as a saviour. So it kind of bookends the series quite nicely as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we did the interview in October, so we could have peppered him throughout it and just had him as another guest saying, no, this is why I did it. But it's all about him. You couldn't have him as one of the cast. He just has to have an episode devoted to himself. And that thought hadn't really struck me when I first heard we were getting him. It was quite quick. After we were told he was ready to do it, we got studio booked in Moscow, and boom, then there he was, a couple of days later in front of us. But it was when the production team sat down and said, I think we'll keep this for a bonus at the end. And then you think, right, okay, now all that's missing is the interview, and who knows how that's going to go. And I mean, given what we heard about him and the way he goes about his business, it was anyone's guess what was going to happen. So we sat down with him for about it was almost 3 hours at the end of the process. And I remember lying on the floor at the end of it with my hands on my head thinking, have we got anything useful in that? And that whole thing's muddied, right? Because it goes through an interpreter. So you ask a question, it gets translated into Russian, he answers in Russian, it comes back to you. So obviously that takes twice as long. You can't interrupt, you can't have a proper conversation. There's no real dialogue. It's question, wait, answer.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, it's pretty bewildering. It's very difficult as an interviewer to keep a handle on what's going on. You've really got to listen to it back to work out what you got. So at the end of it, I looked at the boys and said, we even got 2 minutes of usable material in there. And they went, what are you on about? It's dynamite. And then they stripped out they sent me a version not so long ago, actually, with because we put it to one side. We're worried about getting the rest of it done, all the other 9 episodes done. There was always this hanging question. What do we do with episode 10? What do we do with the Vlad interview? What's that going to be like? And they stripped all of the Russian out of it. So it was just my question and then the interpreter's answer in English. I remember driving to, who were Hearts? It was Dundee maybe. And putting that on in the car. They just sent me it on Dropbox. Putting that on, and after 5 minutes, I remember laughing out loud to myself, thinking, this is dynamite. This is absolute dynamite. We've got no problems here. Maybe legally a couple of things that might present an issue, but and there was some of it we couldn't use. But we've certainly got an episode's worth of material in this. He's not, he's swinging punches.
Oh yeah. I was going to say, did you expect anything else? What did you actually expect going in for the review? Did you expect anything else other than basically? To me, it just sounded like it didn't sound like anything had really changed. It felt like he just stuck Romanov in a time machine from 2007 and he's just arrived in 2024 to talk to you guys. It was just basically pretty much the same kind of similar rhetoric, other than the fact that some of the details of his stories that he told before seem to have changed a little bit, which is funny that when you're usually talking out your arse.
Well, isn't it? I mean, when you tell a story often enough for 20 years, it begins to become the truth in your head, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because that's how you remember it, right? And you can tell that story. You could be put up to a lie detector and pass the test because you're telling it with absolute faith. Because you've told people 1,000 times this is how it worked, and it's your truth. But no, I actually didn't know what to expect. We'd had to give him a kind of rough area. Obviously, you would never give anybody the questions you're going to ask them, right? Because that's the first and fastest route to a dreadful interview. But we had to give him an idea of some of the territory we wanted to cover because it was his right to reply to a load of allegations that people have made about the way he behaved. So he had a sense of what was going on, and he'd obviously gone away and done a bit of his own research, and he'd asked us to clarify a couple of things. So he kind of knew roughly where we were going to go with some of it. And I think we said that in our analysis during the interview in the episode. He kind of came in with a list of targets and a blunderbuss and just went through them. So yeah, it was fairly as expected, but therefore kind of despite being as expected, it was also impossible to prepare for.
Okay, and looking at the series as a whole, so you've talked about it briefly already, but if you could take us back, how long ago, when did it first start? When did the first kind of kernel of an idea come up? When did you get on board? How did it all come together?
Well, I think the kernel of the idea came from James, whose name you'll hear repeatedly through this. James Christie and Stephen Hollywood were the producers on this. And James had a notion that this would make a good podcast at some point. And these guys kind of work on podcasts. They're really good creative minds. And they were just trying to find the right moment for it and the right platform for it and the right treatment for it. And I think probably the first conversation happened a couple of years ago. I came in and the BBC Sounds came on board and they were, who do you want to present it? And, I kind of ticked a couple of boxes because I've been going to Hearts since I was 7 and I'm now in my mid-50s. So, I've been around a long time. I lived through this whole thing. I kind of talk for a living and ask questions. So that seemed to be a good fit. And they brought me into a meeting and said, we've got a project for you. So we're doing it was initially meant to be a 6-parter on Romanov as a podcast for BBC Sounds. Do you want to be involved? And, a nanosecond later, I said, yeah, no matter what else is going on, nobody else is getting this. Because it's got hilarity and drama and everything written through it like letters on a stick of rock, doesn't it? It was all, from the moment you heard it was going to be a project, you knew it was going to work.
And is that actually something as well that was a bit difficult in terms of mapping out? Because you were saying that like it's got so much drama and so much stuff all the way through it. Listening to it as a Hearts fan, especially a Hearts fan who, I would have been 18 when Romanov first took over. So that was at a period where I was going to Hearts quite a lot. I was really invested in the team and the fortunes of the team, going home and away, waking up every day and spending at least a few hours on kickback to find out what was happening. I remember always the fourth website, which Mark Donaldson probably used to create when he was back being sports editor, where it was kind of like you keep refreshing it, like just throughout your day because you were ready for the next news bomb to drop. But was it difficult to kind of set out like a structure and to not be like, oh, but what about this? Oh, but what about that? Oh, but what about this? And you're trying to pull it all together because there must have just been so many threads to the story.
You're probably better asking one of the producers that because I wasn't there day in, day out, week in, week out. But I know from the start we had a fairly clear idea of the things we wanted to hit. And the theory we were working to, or the premise we were working to, that this was the story of Vladimir Romanov. It wasn't the story of Hearts. So there are big areas. There were, in fact, years in some episodes that we just glossed over because he was barely there. And there were some months that took 2 episodes to cover because he was very much there and extremely active. So that's quite a useful way to work it out. It's not the story of Hearts through that period. It's very much the story of him. And mercifully, when there were the fallow years of Romanov, when he was kind of not really thinking about Hearts that much and back in Lithuania sorting out his banking stuff and all that, he was also, for example, competing in Lithuanian Strictly Come Dancing on his own television channel and then settling grudges against basketball journalists. So while you've got perhaps slightly boring, stale content when it comes to Hearts, he's up to some mad stuff somewhere else. So you can lift that one episode with a bit of that. So it just tied in. But there's another guy who I just need to mention. Not very much to a lot of your audience, but a guy, Graham Russell, was a consultant to go to, and that's really useful in this process. Somebody you can go to and say, listen, we're seeing the trees. Can you see the wood here? We've got all of this content. What do you need to take out? And he was quite good at just saying, well, that doesn't matter. I'm not interested in that. Pull that out. Boom. There you go. That goes down from an hour and 20 to 35 minutes. But as I said to you, this was meant to be a 6-episode series, and it was 10 in the end because we got so much good stuff.
And just from both a journalist and a Hearts fan, and knowing some of the stories over Romanov, and I remember like in the early days as well, everybody was signing non-disclosure agreements and stuff like that. And obviously Romanov's got this reputation as being, for lack of a better phrase, kind of quote-unquote dodgy character. Were you just yourself personally surprised that so many people said yes to interviews?
It's funny, isn't it? 20 years is a good period of time. It's 20 years since he bought his first shares. I think that was the first week that we went, the episodes 1, 2, and 3 went out. And he's tucked away in Russia, right? And not likely to emerge for quite a while. B, hadn't been heard of for a long time, so people feel fairly safe. And C, just it's 20 years, man. I mean, it's history. I think that's good time for a story to marinade. Do you know what I mean? For people to be able to come back and talk about it a bit more freely and openly. There were a couple of people who didn't want to, but not because they were concerned about what the pushback would be, just because they're living different lives now. I spoke to Phil Anderton, who I still kind of keep in touch with occasionally, and he's living a totally different life in a different world. He's got a really good corporate job, and he's kind of compartmentalised different areas of his career. He doesn't really want to reopen this one. It's done nothing in it for him particularly, but it would be nice to hear what he thought about a couple of things, but totally and absolutely respect his decision to say, right now, that box is shut and there's nothing for me in reopening it. It's fine.
And just
sorry, go on.
No, go for it.
Graham Rix was an interesting one. He's the one who I thought might have been quite circumspect. And he was, I mean, obviously, given his circumstances, right? But he'd spoken to the media when he was up here, he'd addressed all that, and you think maybe he's just going to come back and say, no, why would I? What's in it for me to lay myself open again and reopen all these wounds? And now he was really keen to talk. He gave us, we met him in London in Broadcasting House at the BBC, and he gave us 3 hours. And it was quite interesting. He was very nervous, I think, when he came in, didn't know how it was going to work, didn't know what we were going to want. Maybe thought he was going to be stitched up. I don't know. He's got probably quite a few trust issues. And we had long conversations about how we would handle that and whether we wanted to speak to him, given his conviction, given the nature of the crime, given all of that. And there was a long chat about it, but he's got such an important role to play in that story and such an important story to tell in terms of that narrative. And also, his past is his past. Some people will find it impossible to put what he's done to one side. But when he was up here managing for Hearts for 4 months, he was being interviewed every week about the matches he just played in and what it was like managing under Romanov. So 20 years later, I don't think there's any particular moral issue with getting him back in and getting his side of it. And he was remarkably open, actually, and open to talking about everything. But we had to. I think we saw it as a real responsibility to push him a bit on the nature of his past, because that was very much that was central to the scandal of hiring him.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure at the time it was fed that he was somebody that had applied for the job and had just been impressed by him, blah, blah, blah. But no, it was actually that they'd sought him out.
No, you could have knocked him down with a feather when the phone rang and they asked him, do you want to, instead of Gianluca Vialli, Claudio Ranieri, Bobby Robson, whoever, do you want to be manager of Hearts? On PS, 10 times your previous salary.
Aye, pretty much, obviously, fill in the blanks. It seems like they definitely just wanted somebody that was They felt that they felt that they could manipulate and mold and manage and do their bidding based on what his reputation was.
To an extent, but I mean, forgive me if this didn't make the edit, but and maybe he didn't even say it on camera. Maybe he said it when we were chatting to him. But he reckoned Vialli had been approached for the job and had either said no or didn't make it. And he'd coached under Vialli and got on really well with him at Chelsea. And his theory was maybe Vialli had said, "Nah, it's not one for me." But I tell you, this guy Ricks. And then, fill in the other blanks as you wish. Maybe Romanov thought, do you know what? And he's got this hanging over him, right? Perfect. He's not in a position to give me any pushback. He needs it.
That might be the case. And I'll tell you why I maybe forgot that is because I listened to the first 2 episodes. And then when it got to episode 3, I needed a while. I needed a while to get myself up for it. And I eventually listened to it when I was drunk. Because episode 3 was the Burley episode. And emotionally, wasn't quite ready to put myself through that again of the hope that you were going to see your team win a league title, which I'm just, now at the age of 38, I've just kind of given up the fact that that's unlikely to ever happen in my lifetime, that I'll see Hearts win a league title, or anybody else other than Celtic or Rangers win a league title in my lifetime. So it was just hard to go back to that. So I listened to that when I was drunk, and then I think I just let it go on to the next episode, the next one. So that's why my memory's a bit sketchy of those 2.
Yeah, but now we know. I mean, it's even more painful. We know that they were actually in the process, as they sacked Burley, of identifying Champions League player who they were ready to put into that already unbeatable team to make it completely unstoppable. I mean, literally listen to that with their head in the hands. And that was an interview, by the way, that we did on the day of that broadcast, like 2 weeks ago. Just going to people saying, "What do you think about this? What do you say about that? He's been talking about you." And it was Simon Hunt who came back and said, "Yeah, no, I'll tell you what, I've got a story or two I can tell you." And that's where that came out. We were picking up stories literally until the very last day.
Is there, from being a Hearts fan and living through it all and then playing like you said you weren't there when it was kind of like storyboarded out and stuff, but was there anything that didn't make it that you kind of wished had been in, or just when you first kind of came to the project, you kind of thought like certain stories or certain events that you kind of stuck out for you that just kind of, just in terms of fitting into the narrative, just didn't work?
I'd quite like to have spoken to Robbo about it. Because he seems to have handled everything that happened to him in such a uniquely dignified manner. And at the time, just accepted what was going on, and right, if it's for the best for the club, then I just have to take it. But I wonder how, if people feel a bit more able to speak openly and honestly and with a bit more emotion 20 years later. Robbo's never one for holding back either, is he? And he's never, he never uses too few words. So I wonder what his take on it is. But he just wasn't up for it. I don't know why. I contacted him a couple of times, and he just he was on holiday the first time I texted him. He came back and said, what are you after? And I said, this is what we're doing. And he said, nah, duh. And then I came back and he just didn't get back to me. And we just kind of to be honest, we let the trail go cold. Not least, actually, because the story really kicks off when Burley arrives. Yeah. And we had so much to get through in terms of buying shares, getting all that, doing whatever. And as discussed, it was the story of Vladimir Romanov, not the story of Hearts or Robbo or anybody like that. But it's just, yeah, if there was one person I would have liked to have got who I didn't. And also, the other answer to that question, and it's a genuine answer, is I wish we'd been able to speak to George Burley because of the reasons that we weren't able to speak to George Burley. He's had this cancer diagnosis, and he said no initially to us, and we just didn't bother him, obviously, again. So I wish those weren't the circumstances. And it obviously would have been fascinating to hear his version of it. I suspect it wouldn't involve, as Vladimir Romanov suggested, him mysteriously asking for a cigarette break in a meeting and then running away, never to be seen again.
Yeah. That was a strange one. That was a strange one. Well, perfectly normal for the rest of the interview, but yeah, that was especially when you go to Simon Hunt. It was like, well, Burley doesn't smoke, so
yeah, go figure.
Yeah, because and for reasons like you said, that there was just so much that you just couldn't fit in. Because I was just kind of thinking, like, one that always stood out for me was the 07-08 campaign. And I think you mentioned it at the start, but then that's when the banking crisis starts to happen, when Romanov starts to disappear. But that was a campaign where it was like, Hearts basically didn't have a manager for like the entire season. Like it was Frail and Korobochka, but then they had that Angel Chervenkov character who was also in the dugout, and nobody quite knew if he was in charge or if he was just there to provide a bit more like support. And then it got to like the time we were playing, I think it was St Mirren on Boxing Day. And the place is just fed up. It was like second bottom of the table by that point. If it wasn't for Gretna, you'd be in serious relegation bother. And the fans are just entirely fed up. And then it comes out a few days later that they make Stephen Frail the manager. And then at the end of that season, it finishes off. They want Mark McGee. Mark McGee's going to be the manager. He's definitely going to be the manager. He's about to get a plane to Lithuania. Oh no, he's changed his mind. But that's not really the Romanov story. That's just the Heart story while he's away doing other things.
We did cover that off a wee bit. At the end of one of the episodes, we did like a roll of honour of managers who have occupied that seat in the dugout under Romanov. And it was meant to be like, you know, at the Oscars, the people who have died in the previous year, you get the somber kind of cello music that plays over it as these names go up. Well, it was meant to have a feel of that about it. And we kind of didn't know if we got anybody. But John McGlynn was in there about 250 times. So...
Well, enough about stories that weren't there. What about the stories that did make it? And what was your favourite from being the person who had to read this out to the audience? What was the story that kind of stands out to you? Was there anything you didn't really know before?
Yeah, I didn't know Romanov had instructed his secretary to attack George Fuchs with his shoes, with her shoes. if he tried anything on aggressively in a meeting. I mean, obviously, Lord Fuchs, as we gave him the opportunity to right to reply, he denies that ever being the case and says that Julia in the meeting was a lovely woman who was no more likely to attack him than anything else. But no, that was I think when I heard that, I thought, jackpot. He's absolutely going for it here. Again, caveat, it's almost certainly not true.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, there's just little bits and bobs. I mean, Pajama Man and the kind of ghetto blaster that plays. Do you know what? Who was it? Was it Bednar? Said, here's one that I really like, right? So Rima with the magic sticks, who defined which injuries players had and how long they'd go on for, right? Bednar comes to her and says, I've got a dodgy hamstring. Can you assess it for me? And she says, yeah, no problem. Which one is it? And he says, you tell me.
Then she
runs away.
Aye, that was good. So when you listened from a Hearts fan's perspective, when you listen to the first kind of few episodes, I pretty much, I was like, I know about 95% of this, but it's good. It's told in an interesting way. It's kind of good to relive it. It's after all these years. But there was like people asking who weren't Hearts fans, would I like this? I was like, oh no, yeah, you will definitely like it because it's such a good story, and you won't know most of it. I think what was good is the podcast progressed and you got in more to, because I'd heard of Pajama Man and Rima with the golden sticks, but you didn't really know anything more on top of that. And then obviously once you're talking about Romanov's dealings in Lithuania and some of that stuff, and also the story, this was from earlier, but the story that Charlie Mann told about being like swapping cars like 3 times and being taken to this secluded farmhouse, and then nobody even speaks to him. Romanov just looks up the entire time. But I felt like as it went on, there was more things to learn for Hearts fans as well that had probably either slipped under the radar, or often as well, like back at the time, you remember, like, it was the whole dividing the Hearts fans amongst, like, hat kickers and Vlad Sheep of, like, who was Romanov and who was anti-Romanov. And I think there was a lot of stuff that just fans didn't really want to hear at the time, because it's hard. It's hard to be like, oh, yeah, the guy who's running our club and has us, by the short and curlies is absolutely off his fucking head.
Yeah, exactly. But, I mean, he did just enough at the start. Remember, I mean, the Michelina sending off and the Andy Davis penalty decision and all that. I mean, I tell you, he kind of did what that kind of bunker mentality stuff that's worked so well with Fergie at some clubs, that Celtic and Rangers fans love when their boards do it, all that kind of stuff. He touched on that there, but he did it in a very Vlad way. He tried to do what he thought was the right thing, and it almost got there, but he just messed it up a bit by being too outrageous. So that was quite interesting. But the other interesting aspect to that for me was how visceral the anger towards Andy Davis still is among big sections of the Hearts support 20 years on. That's the only aspect of any of this that got us any criticism. in terms of the broadcast. You glossed over that, the whole lot of you lick spittles. It's an absolute outrage. I can't believe you didn't call it out for what it was. Mate, settle down. It's 20 years ago.
No, never forgiven, never forgetting.
No, seems not. I'm just too nice.
It didn't help that Andy Davis was quietly retired at the end of that season as well, which really just fed into more of the conspiracy stuff at the time. But no, I'm still raging about it. I interviewed Lee Miller recently, and he was kind of like, all the stuff afterwards about all the conspiracies on the front page of the newspapers afterwards. That was wild. And I'm sitting there thinking, why was it wild? Should have been there.
Well,
fucking cheated, mate. Cheated.
In fairness, it is as clear a piece of evidence as you're going to need if you're mounting a case for the prosecution that there is a conspiracy. I mean, that's Exhibit A, right?
Right, pulling it back to Vlad, though, just a couple of questions left, because I know you kind of struggled with this at the end of the podcast as you were asked about it. It is a strange paradox of a story, because Hearts, I think to a lot of fans, and I'm certainly counting myself as well of them, are ultimately in a better place now than I think they would have been if Vladimir Romanov hadn't come in. The fact that he came into the club made Hearts a better club. But at the same time, as you detailed throughout these episodes, the manner in which he ran the club was just, so many things were wrong about it. Just about everything was wrong about it. It was like ongoing shambles. And yet, he keeps Hearts at Tynecastle. There was also another thing as well, which was that there was like, not only did they keep Hearts at Tynecastle, like as soon as he turned up, there was like 3,000-4,000 fans that started going to Tynecastle every week who never actually left. It's still like that kind of bigger crowds now that it was at the time. And ultimately, no Vladimir Romanov, no Tynecastle, as Mark Donaldson said, probably might even be playing in another tier. And it's so weird that he was so destructive in many, many ways. And yet, you just put a kind of pin in one side, pre-Romanov and post-Romanov. Obviously, once you get beyond the administration and relegation, in a better place.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I thought Mark Donaldson massively undersold that analysis. There's a very clear narrative thread in my mind that suggests that Hearts wouldn't exist if nobody else was coming in. Nobody else was coming in to save the club. Our ground was going to be sold. We were going to move to a Dust Bowl rugby stadium that we wouldn't even wouldn't have quarter filled it. And you can see from that, so the atmosphere deteriorates, the results deteriorate. There's a death spiral there that leads very clearly towards Hearts not existing these days, or not existing as a full-time club. I mean, who knows where we'd be, where we'd be playing our football, if we'd be playing our football, if he hadn't come in. So for that, you're going to love the guy. I mean, there's nothing else to it. But for the fact that he left us effectively where he found us, on the bones of our arse, and looking oblivion in the face again, I mean, the gratitude dries up a bit. But then, you know, after the decade or so he was there, that's enough time for the foundation to actually kind of... There were enough warning signs. There were years of warnings towards the end, which was enough for smart supporters to start mobilising a bit and get the foundation together and really put into place a structure that's made us stronger than we could ever have hoped to have been at this stage. So he's played a massive part in our club's modern history. And I think when the history of Hearts is written, he's got to be seen as the guy who saved them, rather than anything else.
Yeah. And it also as well, like, just you kind of mentioned it there, kind of what happened next with the foundation and Ann Budge, and considering the criticism that both of them have taken across to this season and recent seasons, kind of feels like from their perspective, it's been this is just something that kind of occurred to me while I was listening. It's kind of a good time for fans to be reminded of what came before and how mad it was and how close the club did, again, to going out of business before Budge came with the ponied up the money to be able to buy the club, and also the efforts of the foundation to get it all kind of started. Yeah,
but nothing's ever good enough. Jambos will never be happy.
No.
Never.
What have you done for me lately?
Yeah, exactly. We're an awful bunch like that. An awful bunch for the ingratitude.
Right, Martin, thank you very much for joining me.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everybody for listening. And if you have not listened to the podcast yet, then I thoroughly recommend you do so. You can find it on all the podcast players. That is Romanov, Czar of Hearts. But for the meantime, thank you for listening to this, the Tennis Podcast, and we will talk to you again soon. Goodbye.